I am Marie Bernard, the NIH Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity, and I welcome all of you to this next session of the Scientific Workforce Diversity Seminar Series. We're featuring outcomes of NASEM's Advancing Anti-Racism, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in STEM Organizations report. NASEM released this report in February, and they've been busy spreading the word about the important context, data, and recommendations produced by its interdisciplinary committee. We are delighted that the two committee co-chairs, Drs. Gilda Barabino and Susan Fisk, have agreed to meet with us today to help digest the contents and consider how each of us might contribute to enhancing the equity and inclusion of people from all walks of life. I'd like to take this opportunity to address some frequently asked questions. First, you can access a copy of the speaker slides by visiting our website, diversity.nih.gov. I'll say it again. Please share it with your colleagues who might be late getting into the room. You can access a copy of the speaker slides at diversity.nih.gov. We're also recording the event and anticipate posting that to that same website within the next few business days. If you'd like to submit a question for the speakers, please use the Q&A feature in the toolbar. We don't anticipate that we will be able to get to every question because there's been a really robust response to this opportunity, but my team will be collating submissions and will identify common themes. And we'll get to as many of them as we can. If you require technical support at any point, please email our host at the email address that's shown in the slide. Okay, I would encourage you to share your thoughts about today's event using the link provided in the chat. You can also scan the QR code on this slide. Your feedback helps my office plan future events and, importantly, to evaluate the seminar series program. We launched this in September 2021 as part of my strategic plan for the consulate office, and I want to ensure that our seminars are informative and engaging for our audiences. We're now going to take a poll. We're going to ask everyone in the audience to complete a brief poll so that we can learn more about who is in attendance. We'll give you about 1 minute to respond. Ms. Lang.
Okay, I see we have about 80% of people have responded, so I'm going to end the poll.
That's Ms. Nicole Lang who is speaking, a really invaluable member of our team who does all of the logistics for these sorts of things. And what we see is that we have 58% of the population who are from government, 26% from academia, 12% from nonprofits, and smaller percentages from for-profit and other organizations. And it looks like 46% of people are administrators, 11% are executives, and smaller percentages in the professoriate, 4% are trainees, 32% are other. So that gives you a chance to understand who's in the audience with you. It's very helpful to us as we move forward with this. I now have the privilege of introducing today's speakers. Dr. Gilda Barabino is president of the Olin College of Engineering and a professor of biomedical and chemical engineering. She served in various leadership roles and is currently president-elect of AAAS. She is also an active member of the National Academy of Engineering and the National Academy of Medicine and serves on numerous committees of the National Academies, including the Roundtable on Black Men and Black Women in Science, Engineering and Medicine, and the Committee on Women in Science, Engineering and Medicine. Dr. Barabino consults nationally and internationally on STEM education and research, diversity in higher education, policy, faculty development, and workforce development. Dr. Susan Fisk, the Eugene Higgins Professor of Psychology and Public Affairs at Princeton University, has studied diversity for more than 40 years. She testified in President Clinton's initiative on race and in landmark cases related to gender, age, and LGBTQ+. A member of the National Academy of Sciences, she recently won the BBVA Frontiers of Science Award. Her NASEM service includes chairing the Board of Behavioral, Cognitive, and Sensory Sciences, which proposed this panel, and chairing other report panels such as the Aging Workforce, Research Ethics, and serving on a report about methods for measuring discrimination. So we're really privileged to have these two true experts here, and I will turn the virtual platform over to the two of them.
Thank you very much. And thank all of you for joining us today for an overview of the key messages from this recent report from the National Academies, followed by some additional discussion about the report, its findings, and what we have learned so far. On behalf of the committee, next slide. On behalf of the committee, I would really like to thank the study sponsors, including NIH, who made this important work possible. Next slide. I would also like to thank the staff and the board on Behavioral, Cognitive, and Sensory Sciences who contributed to this report. Next slide. Here, I would like to introduce you to the full committee who worked on this report. For each expert, please visit their bios in the appendix of the report. The appointment process began in the fall of 2021 and included a public call for nominations that collected the names of nearly 400 experts and practitioners. The 18 members of this committee represent one of the most, if not the most diverse committees that the National Academies has ever appointed. Next slide. So, take it, Dr. Barabino.
Oh, Gilda, you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself, please? Thank you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, great, thank you. At the start of the report, the committee felt it was important to create some working definitions of these terms, knowing that these concepts are fluid and subject to change over time. The committee knows and respects that other groups may choose to use different terms or define these concepts in other ways. We still felt it important to have shared language for the purposes of our work. For the purposes of this report, the committee used the definitions noted here, and full descriptions of these terms can be found in the report glossary. Next slide. The committee wanted readers to see that STEM organizations do not exist within a vacuum, and they are not immune from the ongoing legacies of racism that affect society and other types of institutions. This is why the committee felt it important to ground the report in the historical and contemporary context of broader society before addressing the issues faced in STEM organizations, on teams, and by individuals. This history provides critical context for understanding the unequal representation of minoritized populations in STEM, higher education, and workplaces. Next slide. In chapter 5 through 8, the report covers the levels of analysis mentioned in the previous slide. 2 chapters on individuals, one from the perspective of people from minoritized groups, and the other from gatekeepers, one on building diverse teams, and another chapter on leadership in STEM organizations. Here you see a summary of the evidence-based conclusions and recommendations in the report. They provide a roadmap for change in STEM organizations with an emphasis on action and building environments that support inclusive excellence. Next slide. There's a lot of data in the report, and some people have asked us why we included the lived experience. The committee was charged to review evidence from lived experiences on the ways in which racism impedes STEM careers for minoritized individuals. Chapter 4 includes a series of structured interviews which provide a firsthand account of the complex range of experiences, emotions, and situations that confront even the most successful Black scholars. The interviews created narrative windows in the lives of these STEM leaders. The final selection of quotes was grouped into the following types of experiences and themes: belonging, racism and racial microaggression, experiences at historically Black colleges and universities and predominantly white institutions, mentors, peers, savvy, finances, and sources of resilience. Next slide. Overall, the main message we want to send is that anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion are not a single set of goals that allow organizations to meet and declare the work concluded. Looking at the subtitle, Beyond Broadening Participation, the committee encourages the reader to think about how efforts to support anti-racism can go beyond numeric representation and bring a focus to equitable and inclusive environments. These efforts demand sustained attention, leadership, and resources to flourish. And now with the next slide, I'll turn it over to Susan.
I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Now that the report has been released, we've been able to hear from a number of readers and participants at engagement sessions. These outreach efforts have been incredibly useful for the committee to hear the common questions related to this report. We're going to sample some of those here now. Next slide. We use the term minoritized in the report. What does it mean, and why don't we use the term minority? The committee deliberated extensively on the terms we would use to discuss groups of people. The term minority signals numeric representation alone, whereas minoritized captures more information about individuals' experiences in addition to being numerically underrepresented. If a group is minoritized, somebody is making them a minority. The committee took various factors into account when deciding on the terms. Some of the factors included an acknowledgement of the history and dynamic aspects of language and experiences of mistreatment and racism and numeric underrepresentation and existing structures and systems. For a more complete discussion of all this, see the report. Next slide. Why do we use Latin or Latine instead of Latinos, us, or Latinx? The committee talked about this a long time and decided to use a gender-neutral term rather than Latino/S and a pronounceable term because Latinx is not pronounceable in Spanish. It's barely pronounceable in English. So Latin is a term created by gender non-binary and feminist communities in Spanish-speaking countries. The objective of the term is also to remove the gender from Spanish, replacing it with a gender-neutral E. Next slide. There's a strong focus in the report, it's true, on Black Americans. And so the question is, what about individuals from other minoritized groups? The committee talked long and hard about this and decided to focus on the challenges facing Black Americans in STEM. As noted in the summary, there's a prominence of work on this topic within the broader research community, as well as by the national academies. There's simply more work done on the situations of Black Americans than other minoritized groups. This focus isn't intended to diminish the importance of addressing similar challenges faced by the other groups, but rather to provide guidance for future work. And we call for additional research that investigates the unique experiences of different groups. And we hope that there will be specific reports on each of the groups that you might imagine. So, but there are specific research items located in the report addressing the situation of Indigenous people, Latine people, and Asian people. And it's part of the evidence-based wherever the evidence exists. Next slide. So what about other identities? For example, gender. It's complicated. If you look at all the intersectional identities at once, then you lose some of the generality, but you gain some of the specificity of experience. In the end, the committee came to the consensus that race and ethnicity would be the primary factors and the primary lens of analysis. But we also acknowledge that people belong to multiple groups, and each group has varied experiences of privilege and oppression. I'll hand this over to Gilda at this point.
So if we go to the next slide. To the question, why does this report include a chapter on history? And weren't those events so long ago? Well, the committee believes that understanding and articulating the history of the United States is critical to understand how present-day racial and ethnic bias and discrimination operate. The review of structural, systemic, and institutional racism, available in Chapter 2 of the report, serves as a frame for understanding how history has shaped STEM institutions in the United States. Additionally, the committee believes that by understanding the history, it becomes possible to imagine how to dismantle the systems of oppression that currently impact minoritized individuals. Next slide. And you might ask, isn't STEM a meritocracy? Well, that is a common belief that STEM is a meritocracy, or a system in which individuals advance based on their ability alone. However, the evidence in the report shows that barriers at multiple levels have negatively impacted minoritized individuals' accessibility, representation, and ability to thrive in STEM careers. Next slide. We note that this report covers many areas of research. The question is, what are the priorities in terms of future investment in ADEI-related work? While there's existing and ongoing research in this field, the committee identified numerous gaps that remain. The committee found that there was a great need for additional evidence-based research to better understand what produces sustainable anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion change in STEM. As part of the statement of task, the committee generated a research agenda, which is presented in Chapter 9 of the report. The committee put forth an aspirational research agenda that pushes the field forward in ways they identified as innovative, necessary, and challenging. Readers should look to the agenda for further guidance. Next slide. The question, why is the term American sometimes used after describing a person from a specific racial group, especially Asian American? The term American is included to help specify which groups of individuals the committee is referring to in the report. Take, for example, the racial category term Asian. When the term Asian is used, for instance, it implies that the person has origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. And there's more details in Chapter 1 on racial categories. The addition of the term American to form Asian American specifies that the person also has an American identity. And if we turn to the next slide, we'd like to give you some sense of what have we learned, what has surprised us, and what do we hope happens next. I'll start with sharing some of my impressions, and then I'll ask Susan to share some of hers. But first, I'd like to mention to everyone, we will have a workshop based on our report, May 17th to 18th. It will be held in Washington, D.C., and there will be follow-up from Lane Shearer, our study director. If you have questions, more details about our workshop are forthcoming, but we would like you to save the dates. So in terms of some of the things that we've learned, I think it's pretty clear that many of the underlying fundamental root causes of systemic inequities still exist, regardless of what form they manifest in. And those underlying issues still leave us with a number and wide gaps in opportunities and access for racially minoritized groups in particular. I believe we weren't necessarily surprised by the report and how the report has been received, but we have learned many things that we knew that have been reinforced. And I'll give you some examples of that. We did have a sense of understanding someone's lived experience, enriching the discussion and our understanding of the areas. And we were able to show that in a strong way with the work that we did in Chapter 4 with interviews of members of the Roundtable on Black men and Black women in science, engineering, and medicine, and other Black professionals and leaders. I think that another thing that's really important is how people have been really receptive to the framing that the report provides, shared language and frameworks to better understand not only the landscape, but how we understand history and context and how to move forward. So a framework and that I think is really important that's been very helpful is that of gatekeeping and gatekeepers. And in terms of hopes for what might happen next, we want to really have serious and deep engagement with the report in ways that it can catalyze further discussion and actions. The report has a number of actionable recommendations, and it would be great to follow how that's happening, how those recommendations are being adopted. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Susan for her impressions.
So I think one of the striking things about this report is precisely that it starts with history. It's amazing how many Americans don't know the history of race in the United States going back to before its founding as a nation. And the reason that history is so important is that it describes how race is in the structure of our society. And so that means that if you want to change the situation, it's not a matter of fixing individual people, it's a matter of changing the systemic features of it. So the report, by example and by its structure, talks about how systemic racism has entered our country and STEM organizations even in particular. And so that means the solutions are structural too. So I think the most important, to me, recommendations have to do with creating structure in organizations where people work together on interdependent teams and get to know each other, changing the incentives to managers, relying on leaders to create a climate and a culture of DE&I and anti-racism. So structural problems require structural solutions. And that, I would say, is the strongest thing that we do. And finally, because we were, roughly half and half diversity scientists and half practitioners, the diversity scientists made sure that everything was evidence-based, and the practitioners made sure that we had actionable, specific recommendations. And I believe we open it up to questions.
Yes, thanks for that, Susan. So if we can move to the next slide, we're happy to have the opportunity to share our impressions, but we wanted to also have the opportunity to answer questions that were coming from the audience.
Well, thank you so much, Drs. Barabino and Dr. Fisk. Before we transition to the Q&A, we have another poll for the audience members. Ms. Lang, thank you. A minute can last a long time.
Okay, the numbers are slowing down, so I'm going to end the poll.
Okay, so it looks like the majority of people know someone who's a gatekeeper, and the majority of people think that diversity trainings without support are ineffective. Thank you for responding to that. So getting into the questions that have been submitted by the audience, either before the meeting or during this meeting, one question is, some people may ask what new information the report brings. Can you please comment on whether barriers for anti-racism in STEM have changed over the years? Have there been any gains? What's new about the report, given that we've been dealing with these issues for generations?
Yes, there are continuing barriers. Yes, some things have changed, but not too many. I want to just go back to, can I go back to the gatekeeping and the evidence-based diversity training just for a second? And then we come back to Gilda's point of view on this, if that's okay. So the reason the gatekeepers are important, one thing that is new in the last several years is that we realize that a lot of bias is unconscious or ambivalent or ambiguous. And so gatekeepers can't be expected to notice when they're being biased, which means that the organization has to keep track of people's patterns of decisions. And it's hard for somebody in a position of power to admit that they don't know what their pattern of choices is. But it's crucial that the organization look at it in a structural way. And then finally, just the point about diversity training. Diversity training is often required of people. And the intent for that is good because we want everybody to be exposed to that. But if you force people to do it, then they'll be resistant. And it's not the best way to do it. We think incentives work better, that as part of becoming advancing in your whichever hierarchy you're part of, that diversity be one of the things that you aim for in a constructive way. And so in order to learn how to do that, if you don't know how to do it, diversity training would be useful, and one would seek it as a volunteer and be more enthusiastic and receptive, we think. Gilda, any?
Yeah, that's great. What I would add to what Susan is saying is that if you look overall, by whatever metric you want, like our environment's more inclusive, or if you look even at numbers, is representation increasing? Even if some numbers seem to go up in terms of degree attainment. But then if you don't retain and you're losing folks overall, the picture is not really changing. So that's part of the issue. So clearly barriers are still there, as Susan was mentioning. And then I think if you think about something that might be shifting a bit, is the focus so much on the individual to the systems. And that really is starting to shift, because if you think about programming and interventions, everything has been like, well, let's do something about the individual. If we shift our thinking, like, is it the individual or is it the system and the cultures and environments that they are entering that need to change? And I think this focus on the systems is new and something that we need to continue to focus on.
Thank you both. Another question. Some state governments like Florida, Texas, my old stomping grounds of Oklahoma, are creating many obstacles for DEIA in higher education. What can be done about it?
Well, you know, when we're jumping in, like from an engineering mindset, when we're always designing and thinking about designing with constraints, when there are constraints such as rules and regulations that are confining and actually seem to be helping us go backwards, you have to become more creative. You have to have ways of working around a particular set of practices. And one thing that tends to be helpful is to be more holistic in the approach. Think about how we're using definitions and broadening those definitions. So we are, as a community, we're all going to have to be much more creative in our thinking and our approaches, broadening how we do particular practices so that there are ways of still achieving the goals in spite of a particular rule or practice that seems like a barrier.
I might add to it that I think part of the motivation for creating these censoring of terms and trying to move focus away from minoritized groups is that the majority white group feels under siege, and they don't understand that it's good for everybody. So in the places where these limitations are being voted in, I think people don't understand that it's not only is it the right thing to do, but it's actually the operational instrumental thing to do to capitalize on all the talent that you have and to have creativity coming from all different origins of people participating in STEM. So it's good for everybody, and it doesn't mean that the formerly or often powerful group is diminished. You grow the pie.
You know, I would add one other thing too. I think activism works. We need to raise our collective voices around what we will stand for and what we won't stand for. And the more we can do that as a community, with these STEM communities coming together and standing for what's right and being vocal and courageous about it, I think that will help as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And there was actually a question for me about where does NIH stand in moving forward with its programs like Unite? And I would say that, yes, we're standing firm and we're moving things forward. Unite was only publicly unveiled February 26th of 2021. And I think that the scientific community is going to see quite a few opportunities from notices of funding opportunity in the near future. I'll talk about some of those that are already out and some of the ones that are in the works when we get to the end of this. But we at NIH definitely recognize the benefit of having diverse perspectives to do better science and the importance of taking advantage of all of the talent that's out there. Next question. Did you take into account people of international origin in STEM areas, or is this a topic for a separate report?
Well, the issues of immigration and foreign nationality are complicated. I will say I think it's one reason why the term American is joined to Asian, because one of the stereotypes differ of different groups. And one of the stereotypes about Asian people in the United States is maybe they're foreigners. And so to say Asian American emphasizes that. And that's less true for other minoritized groups right now. But I didn't really answer your question, which was, did we address it? Not so much.
Anything to add, Dr. Ferrabino?
I would just say, yes, it is a topic for another report.
Okay. Next question. How do you promote the message that diversity, especially in the STEM fields, actually promotes and encourages more valid and scalable research?
Well, I'll start with the social science contribution, which is that where you sit determines what you see. And people with different points of view need to be involved as part of a team in any project, because just because of your, I'm not trying to essentialize people's demographics into their attitudes, but on average, if you have different experiences, you think of different things that are relevant, different populations, different methods, different ways of labeling and understanding things. So that variety of people working on the same problem together, it might create some friction and some misunderstandings, but in explaining those to each other and operationalizing them, then it's a more creative thing than if you have a completely uniform team.
And to that end, I like to quote a friend and colleague of mine, Cheryl Lagans, a social scientist, speaks to like who does science determines who will do science. Mm-hmm. And if we don't have a broad enough spectrum of who will do science, because we've limited who's already doing science, we're never going to get to the point where we have the kinds of broad enough perspectives to solve the problems that we have facing us, particularly as the problems become more and more complex and require perspectives across disciplines, across different borders, including across countries, as we saw, like with COVID, for example. The inability to come together across multiple sectors really is going to limit how we can respond to and solve challenges. So this idea of like who is actually practicing and who gets to learn and become the practitioner or the clinician or the educator or the administrator really does make a difference. Because as Susan was saying, like you whatever lens you bring to it, that's the kind of framing that gets there. Like what questions get asked determines what answers you get. So we need to have that kind of diversity.
Okay. So next question, how can we bring change from the macro level, university, society, discipline, to the micro level, department, graduate education, mentoring, or even more specifically, how does someone in a non-leadership position affect real and influential change in this area?
Well, I noticed that the question was, how does someone in a non-leadership role affect change? I did want to mention, though, like the report, we did spend a significant amount of time talking about the role of leaders, and that is important, and leaders holding others accountable. But the question does come up, like, well, what if you are not in a position of authority? But there are many things that we can do at whatever level we are and in whatever sphere of influence that we have. And one of the things that we have found that I would like to promote, and Susan knows this too, like coming from the social science angle, many times it's as simple as us getting to know one another and sharing stories. The narratives are something that's easily controllable, regardless of if you're in a formal position of leadership or not. And I would, actually promote that as a strategy that could help us connect, get to know one another, and then help one another collectively enhance, strengthen whatever sphere of influence we are operating in.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when you are on a team together, as we were describing, to work together with other people, you need to know who they are, and you can't rely on stereotypes. And there's decades of research indicating that people specifically, when they're interdependent, pay attention to things that surprise them about the other person. So those would be counter-stereotypic things. And there's really good evidence for that. And so once you know more about the person, you can't just put them in a box. And then you think about other people who you might have put in a box who are from the same category, and it snowballs. And I think regular people who are not gatekeepers can foster, interdependence, and can say, our report would be so much better if we could talk to you about it and get your input on it. And so I would argue for that.
Well, Susan raises a good point I'd like to amplify a bit. teams, project-based, working on something together. There's nothing like coming together or learning together than doing a project together. And in the scientific community, we often draw lines around who we collaborate with. And we don't necessarily just collaborate with those who absolutely have a complementary expertise. We have this filter of like who looks like us or who we feel comfortable with. And talking about like something within our own power, we actually can control who we choose to collaborate with. And we can be more inclusive in those collaborations. We can be more inclusive when we start working together as a team on a particular problem that's being solved. And that does not actually happen sufficiently in our own sectors, and that's certainly within our control.
So everybody's in charge of changing norms. And we can all do it individually.
So kind of related to what you've been addressing, there's a question about how can the evidence of superior performance and higher innovation with diversity and equity be used to incentivize structural change? And what would be key initial steps or actions to take when trying to initiate cultural shift in academic institutions?
People have to know it's not one and done. Because when you first start approaching these things, there's a lot of friction. And people have to be willing to commit and to hang in there through the friction and learning to use vocabulary that it doesn't trigger each other, and listening to people defending their points of view. So anticipating friction, I think, is important, because otherwise people bail. And people need to hang in there until you work through the different points of view and have a commitment to working through them. And if people are willing to do that, then we think there's a lot of richness to be gained.
I think another area that you'll hear about a lot is how we do rewards and recognition in our systems, what we choose to recognize, what we choose to reward shows where our values are or are not. And if we really want to show that this is a way forward to have excellence and innovation, we would recognize those who are carrying the load, those who are making a difference by incorporating and being true to diversity, equity, and inclusion and all that they do. We would not tax people who are the ones who are most affected by the lack of equity by saying it's your job to do it. I think Susan mentioned earlier, we'd have more of a shared responsibility. So I do think that taking that on in a way that really shows it is important, and recognizing it when it works well, can go a long way as well, just for people to see and understand what we value, what we recognize, and what we reward.
Just as an example, if in a university you reward research, teaching, and service, you could add diversity, equity, and inclusion as a separate thing. It's not service. It's not research. It's not teaching. It's all those things. And if the institution really values it, then that becomes one more column in people's accomplishments.
Thank you. Can you speak about the role mentoring can play in these efforts at the institutional and organizational and team level? What would this look like?
Well, mentors certainly can, sometimes we make a distinction between mentoring and advocates, like someone's actually doing advocacy. But for a good mentor, there should be some level of advocacy anyway. But this idea of like helping to guide, socialization, like being socialized into a profession or into a particular environment, understanding and being told the unwritten rules, the unspoken, helping guide and encourage. Like sometimes it's as simple as being encouraged to stay in a field. I think as we talked about gatekeeping, I think sometimes people don't realize, especially those who are in positions of authority, how their words, their actions, their encouragement are not actually can impact whether or not someone stays in the field or not. So those kinds of things around mentoring is really important. But I will say that bad mentoring is worse than no mentoring at all. So it's not like this blanket thing, like just give me a mentor and I'm good to go. We really do need to think about how mentoring is used in a proactive and healthy manner. And I've also talked to people from marginalized groups, like sometimes we need to do some self-mentoring or peer mentoring as well. But mentoring as a strategy does have its merit.
And I think mentors and peers who are helpful can come from both your own identity group, but also other identity groups.
Thank you. And just to let you all know, we do have a June 14th Scientific Workforce Diversity Seminar on this topic. So as we sign off from this meeting, there's the opportunity to register for that. I think it'll be a great follow-on to that question. So there's a question about what can we do to retain underrepresented people in academia? The conversation is often getting them in, but what do we need to be doing to retain people?
I'm going to double down on the idea of creating cultures and environments that are supportive and inclusive.
Yeah.
It's one thing, like once people get there, but as I say, recruit, there's all this attention on recruitment. But if the environment is not supportive, people will not stay.
Yeah.
The idea of having a sense of belonging is real. Like that is really crucial for someone's success, and you need support and connectivity to have that sense of belonging and feeling included. It goes back to some of the things I was saying earlier about collaboration. Sometimes it's as simple as you are there. Can I be included in the scientific conversation? Many times people say, well, I don't know what to do for the person who's from a different background. Why don't you do what you do with the people who are from the in-groups, so to speak? It's that bringing in and letting people be a part of the community and being valued for their contributions. So I still think we need to work on those cultures and environments.
Yeah, I would summarize what you're saying by saying, make it a good place to work. People stay if it's a good place to work, so if you hire an assistant professor from a minoritized group and you say, you get to teach the introductory course right away, fall semester. I mean, you're killing the person off, You wouldn't do that to, somebody else maybe, or not as readily. So, think about what makes it a good place to work, and then people want to stay. Pay them what other people are being paid, all the things that make a person want to stay are pretty common.
So the question is, do you see this report as a catalyst for more change and more initiatives? If so, how can we use the report's recommendations moving forward?
Well, I like that we had so many diversity officers from academia and from government, well, not government, but other organizations, because they really made us say what you have to do. And you can take the list, and nail it to the door of the highest ranked person in the organization, say, here's what we have to be doing, It's pretty concrete, and it has to be maintained over time. You can't do it for a year and then say we're done with that initiative. It has to change the structure of how we live in our STEM organizations.
Well, just to add to what Susan was saying, like one way that the report can really have life is for people to engage with it and say, here's a recommendation. It was in that report, and I'm going to bring this to my unit, my organization, my leader. One of the things that we found as we were doing the report and talking to people, there was this sense that, well, I want to do something, I don't know what to do. Or is there some evidence that such and such works? Or, like this idea, like, help me, give me tools, or give me information, give me the evidence that backs it up. You can go to the report and in one place have a historical context, a contemporary context, a set of chapters that tell you this is what happens at the individual level, the team level, the organizational level. Here's some recommendations. providing people with tools is helpful, providing people with some shared language and a basis upon which they can have some reference to something to talk about and have that continued dialogue and say, I'm using it this way. How are you using it? That way, the report actually could have some life and could make a difference as we move forward. And then we should be sharing what our learnings were and how we implemented aspects of the report in our particular institution or the unit we were in. And that's something that we were looking for as a study committee, how we remain engaged with the implementation and broader engagement of the broader community with the report.
We're getting to time, so I want to ask you two quick questions. Not so quick, probably. Do you have a few recommendations for how funding organizations such as NIH, NSF, and nonprofits can efficiently facilitate structural change within their grantee institutions?
I think it's tough, but when there are some goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion, really tie it to funding. I think we say we're tying those things to funding, but if someone's really not meeting some of those goals, we don't take the money away. I mean, money talks. So I really think that agencies can hold people more accountable in how they use the funds that they've received from that agency. And I also think agencies do have influence because people want to get the funding from the agency. So if the agency says, in order to receive this, we would like to see X, even for things like how do we pay our postdocs and show them that they're valued. There are policies and practices where an agency can actually be in front of where we need to go and help institutions move by taking that stance and funding in a way that says this is an important value for the scientific community. And I believe institutions will get in line a bit because the agencies have that level of influence, at least in how they fund the scientific enterprise.
Add one tiny comment to that. I endorse everything she just said. People have to show results. So if you're admitting more minoritized graduate students, it's not who you admit, it's who you graduate that matters, and do they get jobs? Track record.
Okay, very good, thank you. Okay, for each of you, 30 seconds, 45 seconds each. Based on today's discussion, what is one action you suggest our audience members take to advance anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Form a book group about the report. Have a book club and read it together over time.
I really believe that's a very important, easy strategy because you have to have things that people feel that they can do right away. And that's why I'm going to say share those stories and put the narrative out there that will help move the whole agenda forward. So stories, narratives, and get a book group.
Okay,
and not only, just not only minoritized people's stories, but everybody's stories. So it's not sort of a voyeuristic thing.
thank you. So I'm going to ask Ms. Lang to put the slides back up because there are a few additional points that we would like to make that really meld very nicely with the comments that you all just made. First, we'd like you to save the date for our next seminar on June 14th. How does mentoring impact diversity in the biomedical and behavioral research workforce? We've talked quite a bit about mentoring towards the end. This will be a chance to delve deeply into this. It will feature evaluations and perspectives from Juan Amador from the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, or SACNAS. Drs. Angela Byers-Winston and Christine Fund from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. They have a really strong mentoring research shop there. And Dr. Karen Salt from the UK Research Innovation Group, kind of the equivalent of our Office of Science and Technology and Policy. I'm particularly excited that our partners from the UK will be joining us because it'll be an opportunity to compare and contrast approaches across the pond. More information will be posted on our webpage at diversity.nih.gov. Just go to the icon for SWDSS. And we'll also share the registration link with everyone who's attended today's event. Additionally, if you're not already familiar with NIH's Unite initiative, it's very relevant to today's discussion. The whole point of Unite, it serves as a think tank to identify and address any structural racism that may exist within NIH and the broader scientific community. Our whole point is to bring about institutional culture change, both within NIH and in our funded institutions. And the progress report is a really nice summary of what's been done from 2021 to 2022. And the website in general tells you about the latest developments. Next, please. Of note, there have been several notices of funding opportunities. We call them NOFOs now instead of FOAs that have been released from the Unite Initiative. One is the Science Education Partnership Awards, or SEPA Awards. This is a program to allow for K through 12 STEM education under the purview of the National Institute of General Medical Sciences. They have a legislative mandate to do this, and it's been expanded now with 17 institutes and centers having signed on to it, with the thought that we can see that there's quite a bit of diversity when you look at the K through 12 population. We know that the diversity goes down progressively as you go through high school, college, graduate school, postdoc, faculty. But if we can capture those young people and get them excited early on, we may help to keep that pathway fuller of people from diverse backgrounds. The data show that science identity is often developed as early as middle school. So excited that we have so many ICs that have signed on to that. We have just released in the last 10 days research with activities related to diversity, NOFO, that is as a result of Unite, that gives an opportunity to fund scientists who haven't previously had NIH funding, or who do not currently have NIH funding, to recognize their excellence in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. It's a great accompaniment to the administrative supplements that have been led by my office to recognize excellence in DEIA mentoring. The administrative supplements, of course, have to go to someone who's already funded. It's a supplement, so it's a year or maybe two if you're at low resource institutions. The reward competitive grant is 4 to 5 years of funding. And there's an instrumentation grant program from limited resource institutions that was released in the last 10 days. We also anticipate announcing prize competition for institutional excellence in DEIA in early April, so stay tuned. And just last week, NIH released its NIH-wide strategic plan for DEIA. It articulates NIH's commitment to embracing, strengthening, and integrating DEIA into all aspects of our activities, including operations, workforce, and research. I encourage you to read this. It's a framework for what we will be doing going forward, and it serves as an umbrella for all of our DEIA activities. If you didn't see it, Dr. Mike Lauer and I co-authored 2 blogs with updates on funding rates for R01s and K awards by race ethnicity. So you can find those on the Open Mic blog. And finally, I encourage you to stay connected with our office. Please consider subscribing to our newsletter, our blog, follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. And thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your feedback to this event. So please complete our survey and join us June 14th. Have a great day. Thank you, Dr. Barabino, Dr. Fisk. It's a great session.